so delighted to introduce Dr. Deboleena Roy. Dr. Roy received her PhD in reproductive neuroendocrinology and molecular biology from the Institute of Medical Sciences at the University of Toronto. She was a visiting scholar at the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women at Brown University and has held faculty fellowships at the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University and the Fox Center for Humanistic Inquiry at Emory University. Dr. Roy is professor of Emory's Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, as well as professor of neuroscience and behavioral biology. She is currently serving as the Senior Associate Dean of Faculty for Emory College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Roy's research centers on the development of feminist practices that contribute to scientific inquiry in the lab. Her areas of research and teaching include neuroscience, molecular biology, feminist science and technology studies, feminist theory, post-colonial studies, and reproductive justice movements. Dr. Roy has published numerous journal articles and contributed to several anthologies. Her most recent book is entitled Molecular Feminisms, Biology, Becomings, and Life in the Lab. As one reviewer of this book states, Molecular Feminisms is a joyful book, thrumming with the pleasure of intellectual adventure, a celebration of interdisciplinary scholarship, and an affirmation of the generativity of scholars reaching across research domains. Virtually all aspects of Dr. Roy's work reflects who she is as a scholar and researcher, what one colleague describes as an expert natural scientist, as well as an intrepid feminist theorist. And on a personal note, as we were recruiting our first full-time WGSS scholar teacher for the Oxford campus, Dr. Roy provided immense support and assistance to me as chair of the search committee, and I want to publicly thank her for these acts of generosity. Again, it's such a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Deboleena Roy.
Thank you so much, Patricia. And I should also mention your generosity. Thank you for the invitation to give this talk and for supporting me through this process to get me to the talk. And thank you, Gray, also for organizing today's Zoom call. It was a pleasure working with you, Patricia, to recruit the fantastic colleague that you have at Oxford now. And in fact, Alex Olson, had a life before she entered into academia as a spoken word artist. And I used to use her work when I first started teaching in women's studies. So I feel like it was a full circle and a wonderful outcome. So I am really excited to be speaking to all of you and to hopefully have some great discussion afterwards. I have written out my talk, and I think Grace said, around 45, 50 minutes. I'll go for that. I've written it out so that I stay on track. But, if anybody wants to jump in and ask a question, I'm all right with that, or we can leave it all to the end as well. I'm going to screen share, if that's okay. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So as a feminist neuroscientist and a joint faculty member in the Department of WGSS and NBB at Emory University, interdisciplinary work is my bread and butter. After years of conducting research and teaching courses across the natural sciences and humanities, I know that interdisciplinarity can be thought of in multiple ways. The primary focus of my interdisciplinary work has been motivated by a commitment to understand and to learn how to appreciate the intricate practices of disparate disciplines. This may be due to the fact that I began my training, as Patricia mentioned, as a scientist and began training to become a feminist scientist during a time that is now referred to as the science wars. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with the science wars, this was a period of heated debate and somewhat hostile exchanges between scientific realists and post-structuralists that took place in the mid to late 90s. These debates involved discussions around scientific objectivity and the possibilities of societal influences on scientific inquiry, what we might refer to today as unconscious bias. The publication of several books and journal articles during this period led to a series of high-profile disputes, and in some cases, a deep mistrust between academics in the sciences and in the humanities. As a graduate student in the neurosciences in Canada, I started my PhD in molecular biology and reproductive neuroendocrinology just as the science wars were in full swing. I was actually blissfully unaware of one of the most scandalous scholarly disputes that transpired during the science wars. It's known as the so-called affair, and we can talk about that later. But somehow I had already come to the understanding that science and society were co-constituted. I already knew that I wanted to become a feminist scientist who could bring reproductive justice work into conversation with reproductive biology research. I also knew that this would entail learning the intricate practices of disparate disciplines and developing an appreciation for different ways of encountering the world. So now, nearly 2 decades after the science wars, we find ourselves in a new era. We find ourselves in a political time and place where all forms of academic research, whether in the physical and natural sciences, or the social sciences, or the humanities, are potentially under threat. Who would have thought back in the 90s when the science wars were raging that scientists would have to stand up for science itself? Who would have imagined that scientists would be marching for science? It turns out that the skills that humanities scholars and social justice advocates have had to hone over the last 2 decades, including interdisciplinary institution building, community organization and outreach, and finding creative ways for obtaining funding support, are now key skills required for everyone in academia, scientists included. In a curious way, I see this strange moment as also providing us with opportunities for forming new interdisciplinary alliances. So a few years ago, I started thinking about putting my interdisciplinary skills into action in novel ways. I decided that I would use my classroom space as a space where students in both the sciences and the humanities could come together to learn how to form joint conversations. It's one thing to teach neuroscience students about feminist theory and women's studies students about biology. It's a different project to provide students with the tools to create their own interdisciplinary conversations and collaborations. I realized that over the years, much of my work across the natural sciences and women's studies has prepared me to facilitate such conversations. So my recent book, Molecular Feminisms, Biology, Becomings, and Life in the Lab, is really a project about learning how to make interdisciplinary connections. It is written not so much as a treatise following the science wars, but rather a guide for building coalitions and for creating horizontal social movements from within the sciences and humanities. The book aims to provide a reflective space for both feminist scientists in the natural sciences who participate in bench research, as well as feminists in the humanities and social sciences who are eager to use scientific research and data to inform their feminist analyses. It also invites scholars of feminist theory, post-colonial studies, philosophy of science, animal studies, post-humanist ethics, and the biological sciences to participate in joint conversations and create what I call shared vocabularies for interdisciplinary work. This project really began with the scientific research that I conducted on the molecular effects of signal transduction mechanisms of melatonin, estrogen, and androgen receptors on an in vitro model of hypothalamic neurons called gonadotropin-releasing hormone neurons, or GnRH neurons. My work in reproductive neuroendocrinology and molecular biology revealed the presence and mechanisms of feedback regulation by pineal and gonadal hormones at the level of the brain in the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, or the HPG axis. These findings were significant for two reasons. First, they provided evidence against a top-down or hierarchical paradigm commonly used to study the HPG axis in mammals. And two, they showed that hormone-based contraceptives and hormone replacement therapies, or HRTs, designed for humans may not only act at the level of the ovaries, testes, uterus, and the breast tissue, but also may have broader systemic effects, including neuroendocrine regulation of circadian rhythmicity and reproductive functions. So interestingly, my decision to pursue this scientific research was in fact driven by my involvement in reproductive justice movements, both at the local and national levels in Canada. The challenge I faced, however, once I was in the sciences, was that in order to get these important scientific findings, my research required using molecular biology techniques and practices that many feminists also harshly critiqued. These practices in turn included the use of bacteria, transgenic animals, in vitro cell lines, and recombinant DNA technologies. It became clear to me that for those of us out there who wanted to become feminists, but also wanted to participate in the creation of new scientific knowledges on the body at the molecular and genetic levels, facing such dilemmas was going to be an important part of the project. Since then, the dilemmas I have encountered in trying to do what feminist science and technology scholar and historian of science Michelle Murphy calls practice science as feminism have been challenging, but also extremely productive. As a result, my efforts and contributions in the field of feminist STS, that's science and technology studies, have been focused on creating more sustained dialogues at the intersections of molecular biology, neuroscience, and reproductive justice work. This next section, I'm going to go into further detail on one particular experiment that I did in my doctoral work that had a pretty big impact on me. So at the beginning of my doctoral work, I had the opportunity to find new forms of communication between GnRH neurons, estrogen receptors, or ER, and estrogen molecules. The molecular biology techniques I was required to learn in order to conduct my experiments taught me how to face the lab bench, how to form experimental togetherness around shared objects of perplexity, and how to break bread, as it were, with my scientific peers and colleagues in the lab. I longed to create new zones of proximity between molecules and my own feminist political landscapes by examining a biological interaction and process that had been marginalized in the sciences, but was relevant to both molecular neuroendocrinology and women's reproductive health. Thus, my excitement when one of my first experimental research tasks involved searching for the expression of estrogen receptor genes and the synthesis of estrogen receptor alpha and estrogen receptor beta proteins in an in vitro cell line of GnRH neurons, which was called the GT17 cells. So GnRH is known to be a central hormone of the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, or the HPG axis. It helps to regulate the synthesis and secretion of two other hormones, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone in the pituitary gland. And those two hormones in turn then work on the gonads and help to produce androgens and estrogens. So I was tasked with investigating the possibility for direct feedback regulation of GnRH gene expression in the brain by the hormones that are synthesized in the gonads, particularly by estrogen. So estrogen, many of you may know, it's involved in much more than just the process of reproduction. It also includes the process of fusion of long bones, the suppression of osteoclast activity, and providing direct protective effects against atherosclerosis. So although estrogens are synthesized primarily in the gonads, they are also synthesized in extragonadal sites and are known to play an important role in coordinating regulatory effects in adipose tissue, in the skin, the immune system, and more. So my doctoral supervisor at the University of Toronto, Denise Belsham, was interested primarily in examining the role of estrogen in the brain in its reproductive capacity. So estrogen is a very interesting hormone in this respect, as it has been shown to negatively regulate GnRH synthesis, but it's also necessary to induce the pre-ovulatory surge of GnRH during the menstrual cycle. So it both represses and it also enhances GnRH synthesis. So one would imagine, therefore, that estrogen would have something to do with the regulation of reproduction at the level of the brain. So the research that we conducted would almost be considered unnecessary if it were not for the fact that experts in the field at that time had for decades declared that GnRH neurons did not express the proper nuclear protein receptors that bind to estrogen. Thus, the working premise in the field and the belief that was held by most neuroendocrinologists at the time was that GnRH neurons could not be directly affected by estrogen. Instead, interneurons contacting GnRH neurons were thought to be responsible for mediating the effects of estrogen and other gonadal steroids on GnRH synthesis and secretion. So this is what I was up against when I started my doctoral work. I was working athwart to expert knowledge in reproductive neuroendocrinology that was unconvinced of a trait, that of a relationship between estrogen receptors and GnRH neurons, and unwilling or uninterested in spending time designing experiments to recognize what could be new zones of indiscernibility. They dismissed this possibility because they could not imagine what estrogen would be doing in that part of the brain. The long-held belief that GnRH neurons functioned without experiencing direct contact by estrogen had resulted in a scientific milieu where novel relations between certain molecules had become inconceivable, and desires for creating fresh zones of proximity were cast aside. At the time, estrogen receptor research was of particular interest because these receptors had just been reported to behave in a manner that destabilized a dominant or majoritarian paradigm in neuroendocrinology. Estrogen receptors were traditionally thought to come in only one form. So for a long time, the field of endocrinology was not aware of the possibility that more than one type of estrogen receptor could exist. However, just before I started this research, the stable unitary identity of the estrogen receptor was displaced by the discovery of another nuclear receptor that bound to estrogen. This caused a minor endocrinological skirmish in its day, forcing estrogen receptors to be reclassified as either estrogen receptor alpha, or ER alpha, the original estrogen receptor, or estrogen receptor beta, the other estrogen receptor. So I began my nomadic wanderings in search of estrogen receptors in the in vitro model of GnRH neurons, moving in and out of petri dishes, in the shadows of transgenic politics, surrounded by scandals of scientific authority, exposed to the gender, race, and class dynamics of scientists in the laboratory, and faced with the anxiety of protein otherness on many different scales. Basically, a day in the life of a feminist scientist. All this was worth it, however, because I knew that by participating in the production of scientific knowledge on the body, I would have a chance to bring together feminist politics and marginalized or minor literatures in neuroendocrinology to form new lines of inquiry. Many scientists, as well as feminist health activists, have suspected for some time that estrogens present in hormone-based therapies and reproductive technologies may be doing more than simply managing the symptoms of menopause or regulating ovulation. I was excited to participate in the production of scientific knowledge that examined the possible direct neurological impacts of estrogen and could perhaps help to address some concerns around the design and use of estrogen-based hormonal contraceptives, HRTs, and new reproductive and genetic technologies. So I recall the excitement that my colleagues and I shared when we first searched for estrogen receptors. We used molecular biology techniques such as subcloning and sequencing to find the genes for estrogen receptor alpha and estrogen receptor beta. We then carried out reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction, or RT-PCR, experiments on in vitro GnRH neurons in search of estrogen receptor cDNA, or complementary DNA. The idea was to show that the transcription and translation of these genes ultimately led to the expression of estrogen receptor proteins in GnRH neurons. Not only did we find estrogen receptor alpha cDNA coding for the gonadal hormone receptor that had been excluded from the mind's eye of neuroendocrinologists, but we also found estrogen receptors other, estrogen receptor beta. We went on to conduct more molecular biology experiments, such as Western blot analyses, to search for the expression of ER alpha and ER beta proteins. Both were found easily in GnRH neurons. Our results proved not only that GnRH neurons express these receptors, but that these receptors directly repress GnRH synthesis in these neurons. The life of these experiments set me onto a new line of flight and onto a series of interdisciplinary inquiries that continue to motivate me to this day. I faced and overcame scientific authority that had stacked the odds against this research and against the ability of estrogen and GnRH neurons to form more intimate zones of proximity. So, although I did not have the vocabulary at the time while I was a graduate student to express myself in this way, I knew that what I had witnessed was a kind of ontological rupture that had moved my understanding of matter from one of fixity, stasis, and being to that of flexibility, change, and becoming. It was as if one night I had gone to bed with a notion of a materiality in which estrogen receptors could not be brought into closer proximity to GnRH neurons. And the next morning, I woke up to an alternative materiality with new sites of play and unexplored biopossibilities for these biological matters. Since I conducted these initial experiments, there have been even more reason to see that biologies are not fixed, and to appreciate the value of moving toward playfulness and the power of the erotic in our search for biological knowledges. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that erotic that I'm referring to here. It has been further reported, for instance, that estrogen receptor beta actually comes in not one, but 4 different orientations or isoforms, including ER beta 1, ER beta 2, ER beta 4, and ER beta 5. Don't ask me why they skipped 3, but it doesn't exist. A third type of estrogen receptor has also been isolated, known as GPER1, and it's also referred to as GPR30. And what's fascinating about this particular estrogen receptor is that it is a G protein coupled transmembrane receptor, or a GPCR, and not a traditional nuclear steroid receptor. So in GnRH neurons, which have been found to express this G protein coupled receptor, this means that estrogen not only regulates nuclear transcription mechanisms, but which happens on a time scale of hours, but that estrogen is also capable of eliciting rapid, exciting membrane-initiated actions, which can take effect within seconds to minutes. So this membrane-bound estrogen receptor can directly modify GnRH neuronal activity and can trigger several different signal transduction pathways that are not affected by the traditional nuclear estrogen receptors that act as transcription factors. So once again, the discovery of membrane estrogen receptors may be of particular interest to feminist health and reproductive justice advocates, as rapid and direct effects of estrogen can help to explain the long observed so-called side effects that many women experience while using estrogen-based contraceptives and therapies. The discovery of estrogen receptors in GnRH neurons and the further discovery of G protein coupled estrogen receptors in both GnRH neurons and other tissues throughout the body serve as opportunities for feminists and molecular biologists to reach toward not just one, but several shared objects of perplexity. So the life of this particular lab experiment continues to shape my efforts in theory making. Beginning with my efforts as a scientist, trying to become a feminist scientist, to a feminist scientist trying to become a women's studies scholar. This lab experiment has encouraged me to slip and grow in the midst of many disparate fields and has extended itself into an immensely productive experiment in interdisciplinary scholarship. It has provided me with the impulse to bring together scholarship that is typically separated by disciplinary distinctions such as the humanities and the sciences, as well as by cultural distinctions such as concepts of the East and the West. Molecular Feminisms was written with several different audiences in mind. So in addition to joining some ongoing conversations in the fields of feminist theory, post-colonial and decolonial studies, and as I mentioned, post-humanism, I also try to join a conversation in what is called new materialisms within science and technology studies. And this book hopes to provide a reflective space for both feminist scientists who wish to participate in bench research and the production of scientific knowledge, as well as the scientist feminists, so who are interested in using scientific research and data to inform their feminist analyses. So the past few decades of work in feminist STS, or science and technology studies, has prepared us for this kind of non-innocent entry into lab spaces for feminists and the participation of the production of scientific knowledge. However, rather than following the more kind of dominant women in science pipeline ideology, and I don't know if many of you in the sciences might have heard of this pipeline metaphor that's used, that you need to get enough women in and make sure they're not leaking out of this pipeline to see how to retain them. I'm trying to explore a less common mode of engagement with the sciences. My goal is to contribute to theory making by creating conceptual frameworks that can be used by feminists to approach the lab bench and to bring scientific research and data out of the lab and revitalize how it is that we think about bodies, biologies, and matter. So as a feminist, I recall my interest and excitement after learning several feminist critiques of science in the early days of my interdisciplinary crossover. These critiques were eye-opening, they were compelling, and they made a great deal of sense to me. Inspired by these critiques, however, I faced the challenges of actually trying to apply feminist epistemologies and methodologies at the level of practicing science at the lab bench. And this was no easy task. While conducting research in the lab, the feminist scientist does not have a great deal of time to spare, or the tools for that matter, to reflect upon and build connections between their love of science and their commitments to social justice. So facing this challenge has perhaps been the most productive and rewarding aspect of my intellectual career. Learning how to articulate this challenge into questions that make sense to both feminists and scientists has been an experiment in itself. So in the book, I try to address some questions that both feminist scientists and scientist feminists may have in common. They include, for example, how do we continue with science after the critiques of science? How do we work toward a biology that we desire? How are we to encounter matter? How can we bring questions of context with us when we do encounter this matter? And how can we reconfigure the relationship between the scientific knower and what is to become the known? So part of the challenge of developing an interdisciplinary experiment involves starting with distinct disciplinary vocabularies. And even when one is trying to address an idea or a concept that is shared by these different knowledge systems. So building these shared vocabularies takes a great deal of time and patience. And having said this, I try to do so in Molecular Feminisms by establishing the book's philosophical framing through what I refer to as Biophilosophies of Becoming. So Biophilosophies of Becoming provides tools for thinking about a broader conversation at the intersection of philosophy and science. This biophilosophy aims to think about and to try to address the difficulty that arises when we examine more closely the relationship between a scientist and their so-called object of study. Perhaps due to my entry into the sciences by way of reproductive justice frameworks, interrogating that relationship between the knower and the known has been at the forefront of my research. By turning to key questions of ontology, epistemology, and ethics, I connect the feminist scientists' dilemmas in encountering what it is that is to become the known in the lab to feminist, post-colonial, and decolonial STS interrogations of scientific knowledge production. I do this by thinking with bacteria in the book, and I ask the question of whether and how they write. I do this by thinking with the everyday lab techniques involved in molecular biology research, such as cloning and subcloning, and I ask the question, should feminists clone? And by thinking with the in vitro cell line of the GnRH neurons that I talked about while I was working in the lab, and ask the question, what do neurons think? So truly interdisciplinary work takes time, and it's full of failures, and it can often leave everyone concerned dissatisfied. As excited as I am to bring this interdisciplinary scholarship forward, I'm fully aware that in my attempt to write a book for multiple audiences, I may have in fact written a book that is legible to no one, except perhaps myself, and even that is not guaranteed. What can I say? It's an experiment. So what I thought I would do is actually read to you all now from the book. I'm going to read a few pages from the introduction and then a few pages from the chapter that's actually called Biophilosophies of Becoming. So the book starts off with a true story. Let's see. Okay. The introductory chapter, it's also called Stolonic Strategies. And I will talk a little bit more about this. You know, the cover of the book, if you can see it, it has a picture of grass. And the book, interestingly, it's about molecular biology, it's about feminism, but a lot of it actually that ties it together is about grass. And people ask me mostly about grass more than anything else after they read the book. But let's see what you all have to say. So a few years back, a severe rainstorm brought down a mighty oak tree in my neighbor's backyard. The tree fell toward my house, with the top branches just scraping the roof above the bedroom where I slept. I've had several tree encounters in my life, from climbing trees as a child, to planting saplings as a Girl Scout, to walking through the mighty trunk of an ancient redwood in California. This particular tree encounter, however, was the first one that nearly ended my life. Despite this near-death encounter, I would not say that I am over trees or even tired of trees, as Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's statement is often understood. I've been around long enough to know that trees, like humans, have to live and die too. Interestingly, the event that was this tree spurred another very curious event that taught me a great deal. The day the tree fell, I was in shock. This shock turned into immense awe as I watched countless animals and insects scurry in and out of the tree's topmost branches, which were now at my eye level. Had the tree trunk not been in imperceptible relationships with several different species of ants over a 60 to 70-year period, it would not have been hollowed out by rot, too weak to withstand the wind gust that brought it down that day. It is not often that one has the opportunity to get up close to the leaves, branches, insects, and other tree becomings that generally transpire 5 to 10 stories above ground. As much as they were opposed to arboreal thought, Deleuze and Guattari were also fully aware of such tree becomings. They stated, "A new rhizome may form in the heart of a tree, the hollow of a root, the crook of a branch, or else it is a microscopic element of the root tree, a radical that gets rhizome production going." End of quote. Indeed, by way of this fallen tree, I was brought into a new intimate relationship with grass, made keenly aware of the strategies used by grass stolons to grow and remake the world. Removing the massive tree trunk and enormous branches from my backyard took several days. But once these were gone, I realized that practically all of the grass that had been growing where the tree had fallen was also gone. This tree may have deterritorialized when it was cut into hundreds of small pieces and removed from the yard, but the microscopic element of its root tree made its way known through the remaining blades of grass that lay crushed upon my lawn. The easy answer would have been to lay down new sod. For several reasons, one of which was most certainly financial, I didn't want to replace the grass that had been destroyed, at least not immediately. I had a sense that the ground should have some time to recover from the blow. But more important, I did not want to erase the event that was this tree so quickly. By opening myself up to the route of least interference, I witnessed over 3 full years the slow processes of stolonic growth in a species of everyday backyard Bermuda grass. I literally spent time watching grass grow. I witnessed, as Dinesh Kumar and Yashbir Singh Shive explain in their definition of a stolon, how creeping grasses spread not by a rhizomatic root system that is underground and generally invisible to human senses, but rather by the stolonic processes of developing new shoots and extending horizontal stems that grow above the ground. Over time, I became captivated with the outwardly stretching veins that run along the surface of the ground, constantly reaching out in search of connections, feeling around. This is how I realized that grass has a strategy that works. This strategy is one of becoming. And as the French philosophers Deleuze and Guattari write, this strategy works at making a communicating world. I use a similar strategy throughout this book to think more carefully about new connections and communications that can emerge between molecular biology and feminism. My hope is to show that by thinking with molecular feminisms, biophilosophies of becoming, and what I also call microphysiologies of desire, we can see that biology and biological processes need not be essentializing or deterministic. As a feminist scientist trained in molecular biology and reproductive neuroendocrinology, I often wonder what knowledges we as feminists might have created by now if we weren't constantly having to spend our time and energy producing counterclaims to essentializing or deterministic language, paradigms, and experimental design in the biological sciences. What if we were able to use, as Audre Lorde suggested years ago, our power of the erotic to think about science, biology, and molecular biology? By the term erotic, Lorde, who was a feminist, lesbian, Black feminist theorist, she was referring to the potential, desires, and creative forces that lie within us to create change. Angie Willey has recently drawn from Lorde's work to introduce the idea of biopossibilities and to encourage us to think differently about bodies and biologies. So can biopossibilities and the playfulness that comes with the power of the erotic change how we approach bodies and matters in the lab? Would feminists be more willing to do biology if we knew from the start that the outcomes of our research would not bind us to an unwelcome fate? What if, after all, anatomy was not our entire destiny, but was indeed involved in the emergent and expressive processes of life forms in all their becomings? What if biological reductionism was not seen as an end to scientific knowledge, but instead as a means to connect more intimately to the multiple microscopic and molecular material actants that make up the world within us and around us? What if learning how to see the world was also about learning how to encounter that world? By using strategies inspired by Grass and by extending stolonic runners between new and old feminist engagements with science, I hope we will be able to think anew. What is at stake here is relevant to scholars in both the biological sciences and the humanities. It is the chance to learn how to approach bodies and matter through new lines of flight and to embrace the erotic possibilities and capacities that come with becoming a blade of grass. So early in my scientific training, I conducted, and as I explained to you all before in the slides, I conducted a series of lab experiments that inspired me to think about questions that lie smack dab at the intersections between feminism, biology, and philosophy. I did my doctoral research in molecular biology and reproductive neurology lab that studies molecular mechanisms of steroid regulation in that in vitro cell line of specialized hypothalamic neurons. The goal of my research project was to further characterize these hypothalamic GnRH neurons, better understand their role in reproduction. And as I mentioned, one of the first experiments I contributed to involved applying molecular biology techniques to search for estrogen receptor gene expression in these neurons. So part of, I think, what is important in my book is I place an importance on the nitty-gritty everyday practices of experimentation, and that for a lot of feminists who have engaged with the sciences, they've done it outside of the lab. And I think learning that kind of the actual everyday practices and the nitty-gritty gives you a different kind of window or encounter into how to approach science. So throughout this book, I emphasize the importance of developing practice-oriented approaches for feminist science and technology studies. Perhaps driven by their background and training in the sciences, the feminist scholars such as Donna Haraway, Isabel Stengers, and Karen Barad have long highlighted the importance of these approaches. Through her concept of cosmopolitics, for instance, Stengers has suggested that an emphasis on practices allows us to learn how to engage with and not simply judge a knowledge system that is not our own. This shift from focusing on the construction of theories in science to developing a better appreciation for experimental practices in science that can contribute to theory making is now a cornerstone of science and technology studies scholarship, perhaps best articulated by Ian Hacking, who has suggested that experimentation has a life of its own. So I have tried to capture the erotic potential that lies within the life of experimentation in this book. And by participating in this life, I've gained a sense of what Deleuze and Guattari meant by reducing oneself to an abstract line and finding a zone of indiscernibility with other traits. In my case, training in a molecular biology lab led me to create intimate relationships and zones of indiscernibility, not only with molecules, but with also many other traits, including feminist activism, feminist theory, reproductive justice movements, neurons, genes, steroid receptors, signaling pathways, and philosophies of becoming. So the next part that I'll read to you from is from Philosophies of Becoming. This is the second chapter in the book, and these are three of the epigraphs that that I include. You can look over while I'm reading. So, becoming a blade of grass is perhaps an odd place to begin the task of developing an interdisciplinary project. Thinking about blades of grass that grow under our feet, or grass that grows on carefully manicured lawns if you happen to live in a concrete jungle, might appear at first to have very little to do with either molecular biology or feminism, let alone theories and practices in and out of the lab. However, the space where these matters all meet has everything to do with how we think about and how we approach the blade of grass. Those of us who have had intimate access to grass, whether in our backyards, public parks, savannas, or in actual grasslands, may be able to recall the smell of freshly cut grass or feeling the cool blades under our feet. Perhaps you can remember sitting on a soft bed of grass while watching a faraway sunset. Some of us may even recall pulling out handfuls of grass only to find a shallow mess of tangled roots growing together. Alternatively, the thought of grass may conjure for you less idyllic reflections and instead raise concerns regarding the threat of deforestation, the development of genetically modified grass to provide even green turfs for playing golf, images of overly trimmed and herbicide-treated lawns that have been produced at high environmental costs simply for the benefit of human notions of natural beauty, or perhaps even remind one of old colonial English gardens and ornamental grasses that were planted and pruned outside of England in order to civilize supposedly backward and barbaric lands. Each and every one of these reflections is valid. What the chapter epigraphs would have us consider, however, is that perhaps our thoughts on grass, whether we are pleased by its presence or not, may not just be about contemplating its role as a silent backdrop to our outdoor excursions, or considering the historical and political factors that go behind our enjoyment of picturesque green vistas. Rather, the epigraph suggests that the thought of becoming a blade of grass or getting closer to grass is more about acknowledging the desires, voice, and status of grass itself. They raise the question of how we as humans act toward and respond to something as simple as grass, and ultimately how we might orient ourselves to a more diverse range of matters that constitute our own bodies, lives, and the world around us. While taking pause to consider our relationship with grass, we may be inclined to start by ruminating on our own human status compared to that of grass and our grand place among all of nature's organisms and elements. The organisms and elements of nature referred to here include non-human animals, plant life, microorganisms, molecules, and even those rocks, minerals, and inorganic matters all around us that have been deemed inanimate or non-living. By beginning with the blade of grass, or better yet, with molecules that love and that work toward becoming a blade of grass, with grass that has the capability to scream, or with a blade of grass that holds equal footing with the sunbeam and the stars, we may be prompted to go even further and pose some difficult questions regarding not only the nature of our human encounters with the environment, but also questions regarding the nature of nature itself. We might, for instance, start to consider more seriously the possibility that the world is perceived and actualized not only by humans, but also by non-human beings, organic and inorganic, animate and inanimate, living and non-living. We might begin to pay attention to and give more credit to the intricate and perhaps even imperceptible forces that push and pull, or desires that are enacted or expressed by non-human organisms, molecules, and elements which undoubtedly contribute to the building up and breaking down of our universe. We might begin to consider more carefully the assemblages and entangled subjectivities that are bound to form between those who claim to observe this nature, never innocently, and those objects in nature which are being observed, but never passively. We may further start to question the limitations of what has come to constitute the human subject as an autonomous agent in a liberal humanist sense in our societies, who through a series of moral and legal codes has been given the right to either observe or the choice to be observed. We may start to wonder how our need for defining such a unified subject has undoubtedly resulted in the articulation of those who have come to constitute that subject's other, both human and otherwise. Where these questions regarding the nature and status of humans, human others, non-human others, subjects, objects, knowers, and the to be known lead us is precisely where the disciplines of philosophy and science have always met, and where they have also promptly become entangled. Some may argue that the boundaries between philosophy and science have never been clear. It is precisely at those spaces of unclear boundaries and entanglements between philosophy and science where feminist, post-colonial, and decolonial scholars have dedicated a great deal of their creativity over the past few decades through their analytical, theoretical, organizational, and material contributions. They have long known the high stakes involved in the not so simple acts of observing nature and producing knowledge. Many have pointed out that not all knowledge systems are considered equal, and that in some dominant traditions of philosophy and science, not everyone is considered capable of being a knower, even when the knowledge that is produced relates directly to their own lives and experiences. Feminist, post-colonial, and decolonial scholars have pointed out the cost of coming to know the world if this knowledge is sought and obtained only or primarily through the limited scope of modern, or what is often referred to as Western traditions of philosophical and scientific inquiry. These traditions of philosophy and science, which are generally traced back to the era of the classical Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle, and the European Renaissance, are defined by a metaphysics that made very clear distinctions between the inferior ontological status of raw matter compared to the superiority of that entity which had the capability of moving from raw matter to assuming a form. Plato treated the body as a mere vessel for the soul. This distinction operates in Cartesian dualisms that further separated man from nature and the mind from the body. This transcendent distinction and relationship between form and matter, or the soul and the body, made its way into the Enlightenment. Ultimately, this metaphysical framework of divisions, distinctions, and discontinuity has led us to the many philosophical and scientific approaches that we are taught and that we observe today, particularly in public and private institutions of higher learning. In addition to seeing the world through the lenses of discontinuity, transcendence, and dualisms, these approaches have been further limited, as some philosophers and historians of science have argued, by their epistemic reliance on reductionisms and claims of achieving aperspectival objectivity. So feminist, post-colonial, and decolonial scholars have argued that these traditions in philosophy and science can be further characterized by the liberal humanist principles that reside at their core. They have suggested that this form of humanism has led to the creation of hierarchies of being, where greater or lesser values are placed on different lives, including human, and expressions of being. Such dominant philosophical and scientific traditions are built upon the problematic belief that there is a singular and easily discernible positive teleology of thought and progress that is somehow unique to the West, and that this entity, the West, is derived from a history and materiality that is somehow distinct from and superior to non-Western thought and cultures. These scholars are critical of the colonial and imperial inflected definitions of what has come to constitute modern philosophical and scientific thought versus the so-called uncivilized or pre-modern traditions of knowledge production. As the philosopher of science, Claire Colebrook, has stated, the way we think, speak, desire, and see the world is itself political. It produces relations, affects, and organizes our bodies, end of quote. If this is indeed the case, that how we see the world is political to the point of organizing our bodies, then something as simple as how we see and think about a blade of grass may matter a great deal to how we see and think about molecular biology, feminism, and where the two meet. If we want to reflect on how it is that we have come to know the world, we must also consider which questions have been asked about the bodies and biologies around and within us, why they have been asked, how they have been asked, and by whom. Much may be at stake in how we orient towards ourselves towards simple matters, and ultimately, there could be much to gain if we follow through with the questions and answers that grow out of these encounters. I'll be wrapping up in about 3 or 4 more minutes. So I asked the question in the book, what can grass do? What can we learn to know if we begin our inquiries by thinking with the blade of grass? It may be of little to no surprise to agrostologists and serious gardener types out there that in a Carl Linnaeus-inspired taxonomical world, grass has been classified as belonging to the kingdom Plantae, the division Anthophyta, the class Monocotyledons, and if we keep going down the taxonomical ladder even further, into approximately 11,369 accepted different species, according to the Kew Royal Botanic Gardens online database, aptly called GrassBase. Although grass taxonomy and the practices of naming varieties of grass and identifying the properties of what grass is itself a vast and productive field of analysis, this book focuses on a set of questions that can be applied not only to our knowledge of grass, but to feminism and to biology. However, as the epigraphs prompt us to ask, how does an organism such as a blade of grass happen? How does a blade of grass extend or retract itself through time and space? What does grass require in order to change, develop, grow, and perish? How does grass react to being touched? And how does grass express desire? By turning to the abilities of grass, we can begin to think about matter and molecules, not only through classificatory and representational terms, but also through the questions of what they can do. What can we learn from the abilities of creeping grasses to spread, not only by developing new shoots that emerge from nodes on underground stems, but in some cases also developing horizontal stems that grow above the ground, such as stolons? Posing this line of questioning is not only possible, but has in fact become eminently relevant to the field of feminist science and technology studies, and to a project such as mine. Rather than asking what counts as grass, defining what grass actually is only in terms of its chemical properties and physical structures, or using the traditional and dominant philosophical and scientific practices of naming, identifying, and placing various forms of grass into neat categories by pointing out what it lacks compared to other organisms and differentiating it from what it is not, I want to take a molecular approach to asking what matter, molecules, and organisms such as grass can do and are capable of doing. By taking a molecular approach to biological matter and nature, I follow a line of questioning that is generally less explored in both feminist theory and molecular biology, one that pursues ideas of becoming more than being, movement more than stasis, change more than fixity, and intensities more than identities or essences in biology. This is not to say that there isn't any value in to organize our knowledge of grass and other biological matters along the principles of being and stasis. But as scientists and philosophers, we are already familiar with the kinds of knowledge that can be gained by viewing the world through this dominant lens of more organized terms. We know, for example, that the chemical elements of grass include carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and hydrogen, and that the enzyme chlorophyll enables the process of photosynthesis in grass. This knowledge is important, and the ontological frameworks and questions that motivate us to gain this knowledge are also important. There's no denying that scientific and social progress has been made and can continue to be made through these practices. By becoming a molecular biologist, however, I learned firsthand that arriving at a valid hypothesis requires a great deal of open-mindedness, and at times, what one might even call ontological flexibility. One had to either learn to put aside their questions regarding the nature of being, or learn how to think about the nature of being and what was being brought forth as a direct result of their experimentation. By working with material actants such as genes, hormones, and receptors, proteins, and bacteria, to transgenic mice, I came to question my own ontological assumptions and was ushered into orienting my thinking in terms of processes and in terms of becomings. Through my own research in molecular biology, I came to appreciate the possibility of moving feminist politics and feminist science and technology studies projects even further into molecular modes of thought by developing these biophilosophies of becoming and treating biology in terms of an event and biology in terms of a process. So in conclusion, becoming a blade of grass is not about finding this organism's place along a hierarchical ladder or evolutionary tree, or highlighting properties or abilities that grass lacks compared to other humans and other organisms. Neither is it about impersonating or mimicking grass. Rather, becoming a blade of grass is a biophilosophy of becoming that involves thinking about the qualities of changefulness and non-human becomings, about kinship and hylozoism, as well as univocity and immanence. It is about making connections to organisms and elements such as grass so that we might find new ways to reach out and new ways to respond to the world around us. It's about using strategies, or what I refer to in the book as these microphysiologies of desire, to approach difference in the world, not through lack, but rather through positive and productive senses. And ultimately, it's about breaking our all too comfortable habits and opening ourselves up to the molecular. And I'll stop there. And this last slide here is there's an open access version of the book if you all are interested, and I can, the link, it's right there, uw.manifold.org, and you can look up the book and you have access to it right away.
And Carrie Bynum has a question or comment.
Yes, thank you very much, Gray. And thank you, Dr. Roy, for that wonderful, wonderful talk and enlightening us here. You know, just before I clicked on this, I was listening to a concert based on Walt Whitman's Blades of Grass.
Really?
And how many different areas that, you know, the concepts in that particular poem have touched over the many, many years. Just a question. I come from the arts side of this and publishing side. What exactly is the definition of the term hylozoism, if I might ask?
Yes. Oh, so I don't even know that I actually mentioned it in my talk. So you might have read part of it before. So, you know, there's different kind of, oh, and you know, it's a good thing. So my publisher, since you're you said you're coming from the publishing side, my publisher, while I was writing this book, said, you know, it's an interdisciplinary book. You're trying to attract different types of audiences. You know what might be a good idea? It might be a good idea to have a glossary of terms at the back of your book, because, you know, people are coming from different spaces.
Yes.
So the term hylozoism, it's a tradition of philosophical thought that recognizes the expression of certain capacities in all forms of matter. And that's kind of in opposition, I guess, or, you know, alternative to hylomorphism, which is a tradition of philosophical thought that views matter as being passive or inert until it assumes that pre-given form. So kind of that idea of that distinction between the soul and, you know, the body, and that kind of, that great chain of being, there are some like raw materials that are given a different kind of place. It's that transcendent kind of order of being. That's the hylomorphism. But a hylozoism is, it recognizes that all forms of matter have some kind of capacity or form of expression.
Ah, yes, that definitely relates to Walt Whitman's poem.
That's right. And so, you know, a lot of people will talk about, well, you're talking about vitalism then.
Yes.
Which is maybe a lot of vitalists might take it up in that sense that, oh, so now you're saying that a rock is sentient. But I think the way that a lot of, and the quotes that I brought up, the epigraphs, it's not so much talking about like a life form that's a parallel life form to humans, but that all matter is active. All matter has some kind of capacity to have an effect, or to have some kind of resonance, right?
Yes, yes.
So, and I think that might be what Walt Whitman also kind of refers to.
I believe it definitely was. Thank you, man, very much.
Okay, Denise Rayner is next.
Hi, that was really very interesting. And I feel like I'm sort of, there was so much and so many different things to think about. I'm still sort of reeling from all of it. I would say I am from both the basic research side and clinical research. I'm a physician. But I did basic research before medical school, before going to medical school. So I sort of have a feet in both worlds. I'm interested in the response of scientists to your whole approach. I can hear, or the people I know, many not really having much background in the humanities, sort of think of it as a lot of gobbledygook, like not being able to navigate the terms or the approach, as well as being very fixed in the way they think about creating hypotheses. And reacting to the threatening side of the information coming from feminists and, brown people and people that are, because many of them are conservative, people they, one, don't respect, so have no real investment in your knowledge, and two, are threatening because they threaten their established worlds. So, how have you found your interactions?
Oh, I mean, it's a fantastic comment question, and I think that what you just said kind of encapsulates like my every living, breathing moment of what I'm always walking between, right? And, I mentioned in what I read just now, like a protein otherness. What I meant by that is that there is this othering that happens when you're not only, you look like a certain way, you're in a certain field, but when your ideas also don't seem to conform to a traditional sense. So my approach in learning to become an interdisciplinary scholar, it's not just been about, hey, here's feminism, this is what feminism has to say, kind of learn it, or get over yourself. And it's been more along the lines of what can I take from feminist thought that I'm already hearing and I know about and I've learned about it as a scientist. And believe it or not, there is overlap. There are ways that, these conversations happen, and you just have to learn to kind of hear it. And I think that's that shared vocabulary that takes time. So my project here, in looking at, for example, the presence of estrogen receptors in GnRH neurons, molecular biologists in the lab, people in neuroendocrinology are fascinated by this. They want to know more about this. They want to know down to the details, like the signal transduction pathways of a G protein coupled receptor that can mediate estrogen's action. That's a serious scientific question. It's also a very serious question for reproductive health and justice advocates who want to work with scientists. In many cases, most of them do actually, not because they know that we need, science in order to get the best possible healthcare or get, the type of medicine that's needed. So reproductive justice is something, for example, I should probably explain. It's a different type of framework than reproductive rights. So in this country, we often hear about reproductive rights, and that's about, the abortion, pro-choice, and pro-life debates. Reproductive justice is not about that debate. Reproductive justice is about people should have the right to have healthy bodies and healthy reproductive bodies. Now, for some people, that might mean access to abortion. For others, that means no. And reproductive justice respects that. But let's say you are someone who wants to use a contraceptive. You want to have the safest one that's going to have the least amount of side effects. Or let's say you want the right to produce and to reproduce, because so many bodies in reproductive justice, we realize in the US particularly, because of eugenics, have been forced not to reproduce. So you have these different kind of people coming together with common causes. And I think it's finding that conversation and trying to go forward with that has helped, present some arguments. Another example that I give you. So even if there's a body of doctors who say, this is not traditional medicine, I'm not going to buy any of this. They will be swayed, for example, by maybe the pipeline issue, that we need some, more representation. We know this is important for our patients. But my question to them is that if you're going to invite others into, into the sciences, it cannot just be head counting. That there's different ideas, and that's supposed to strengthen science, right? The diversity of ideas. Well, that diversity of ideas also comes from a diversity of locations and different kind of knowledge sources. And so trying to make everybody fit into this one pipeline is kind of the problem. The metaphor is the problem. And so I could go on all day talking about this particular thing, but my point has been to find the common places and build from there.
Dr. Roy, thank you so much for what I consider to be such an intriguing and thought-provoking discussion, your presentation. As a scholar and activist in feminist thought, I find it quite interesting that what I think is a social justice movement is being sparked by you within the sciences. And if I understand correctly, the intent is to carry that social justice movement throughout divisions within the academy. And I'm wondering if it will remain, or if the intent is to perhaps silo the movement within the academy, or perhaps find ways of either partnering or perhaps enriching both the academy and those engaged in practice through the work that you're doing. I clearly think that you have done that on a personal level. You've partnered your scholarship within your own thinking with all the practices and principles in the social justice movement. But do you see the academy reaching out to create that same type of partnership? I hope that isn't too garbled.
No, that's a great question. And this actually relates to the question before. I was going to say this, but like I said, too many ideas floating around. So I will tell you that I got my first tenure track job in 2002. I was fresh out of my PhD, and I had never taken a women's studies class, but here I was in a joint appointment in women's studies and in biology, and trying to figure out how was I going to bring these worlds together. And I will say that from the 20 years or so now that I have been in academia, the number of students who actually walk into the class already knowing, science students, who already are just social justice minded, who already have a toolkit that I never had, I am surprised, delighted by it. And it's funny because, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the talk, that, 2-3 years ago, we started marching for science. we started marching for the fact that people should be allowed to gather data and we should appreciate data. And there is a social justice element to this, right? So the students that I'm teaching these days, they know that science can be a partner with social justice. And they might not have the same terminology that I've kind of used in my book, but I do try to invite some of that in some of the other chapters. But what they have is this understanding that, and they might call it, for example, science communication. Maybe you've heard that term, but this is something that, the last decade of scientists who are in training, they'll know about science communication. Like, you need to know as a scientist how to communicate what it is that you're doing, how to properly represent what you're doing. Part of that is about a democratization of knowledge. Part of that is opening that up, what it is that I do. And certainly I think that most, students who go into health and medicine and science, I mean, behind it, there is this hope that, we're going to create a better place, right? That our research, our work, we're dedicating our lives to that. So it's not so far to make that link to social justice. I found that in the classroom, and pleasantly so. Perhaps, I don't know if it's, a byproduct of what the leadership has been in this country for the last 4 years. We have young students who are even more motivated to talk about social justice. So yeah, I don't know if that, kind of addressed, I don't want to silo it. I think it has to be a kind of a co-constituted relationship, that it's not just about extracting the work of social justice people and trying to, bring it into academia. Academics need to learn the skill sets of social justice advocates, and that has to be a sustained relationship.
Are you finding that rather challenging to create that partnership?
I think you can't just turn it on like that. It takes investment in a community. And you're right. I actually entered into the sciences because I had feminist reproductive justice advocates telling me, you're a young feminist, you should learn the science. We need somebody to learn the science. So that's what made me stay in the sciences. But I think that, it's a good question. What else can Emory be doing to sustain that? I think we're making small progress. Definitely there's been the community partnership program for many years, but through social justice and arts and through the Center for Ethics at Emory, I think we're doing some phenomenal work.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And Mort is next.
I'll call you Dr. Roy because I don't know how to pronounce your first name. But I first want to congratulate myself. At the ripe age of 97, I'm participating in this discussion in a meaningful way. You have a plethora of approaches to what we call feminism. So I'm going to comment in one specific area. You referred to the hypothalamic releasing hormone, what it does to the thyroid stimulating hormone, or the gonadotropic stimulating hormone, and then finally to the gonad itself. But then you come back from the gonads and acting as a repression of the further release of the hypothalamic releasing hormone. But there was one thing I wanted to question, which may have an even greater impact on what happens with the whole total gonadal system. And that is the cortical hypothalamic tract stimulating the hypothalamic releasing hormone in terms of how it impacts finally on the gonadal system. I suspect that the cortical hypothalamic tract has a much greater impact in terms of all those factors in the outside world that impacts on what we call feminism. Will you comment on that relationship of the cortical tract?
Okay, so I hear multiple questions there. They're great. And thank you for joining today. So you're right, the corticosteroids have a great impact on GnRH pulsatility. right? So, and it is true that the GnRH release is happening not just in, like the straight kind of increase of synthesis and decrease, but it's actually also pulsatile over time. So there's a circadian rhythmicity involved in there. There's corticosteroids are involved in there. You're correct. Now, that does invite the outside world, right? This idea of, for example, stress levels, increasing our corticosteroids, which then might have an impact on GnRH synthesis. That's a great example of epigenetics in a way, right? That our external environment is having that direct impact. Now, if we talk about feminism as part of that external environment, I think you're right. I think that for those of us out there who think that women should be treated equally as men, that women should not be earning, 30 cents less for every dollar that men earn for the same job. For women who have, there's more of a unequal distribution of labor and work that they have to do in the home. There's a lot of stresses that could be coming into lives. And so feminism in a way is a science that's trying to get to those answers of how do we, deal with the cortisol levels that have been raised. And what can we do to make women and men equal so that we don't have that kind of cortical stimulation?
Thank you very much.
B.
This has been the most wonderful hour. Your presentation has touched so many strings in my body. I can't even specify them all, but several things. Once traveling in India and studying some of the, not actually studying, just in conversation with people, hearing about the various religions there, I was struck by Jainism, because Jainism says, you can't step on a bug, you've got to be very careful, everything has value, and so on. And that's always resonated with me too. And with me, it goes even further. I'm a doctor, so I have the scientific background, but my family laughs at me when I say, I think everything has a kind of consciousness is not the right word, so maybe you can supply one, but everything has a kind of being there, from trees to the individual leaves. I'm looking out the window here, the squirrels, but I go even further. I say, don't disturb the way certain rocks are. I certainly love grass, and I'm much against having lawns with all that they require, from mowing to fertilizing. I'm much in favor of people having clover lawns. And our lawn is becoming a clover lawn. You don't ever have to fertilize, you don't have to mow it, it's evergreen. And it's the honeybees in the springtime with its blossoms. But there's no term for this feeling of we're all one, we're all united, we're all interrelated. And you've brought it out so beautiful with very precise scientific experiments and relating it to feminism and so on. I really appreciate your talk. It has stretched my mind. I wish I had written better notes. But I buy your book.
There's a quote that I put up there by Barbara McClintock, who was a cytogenicist. She's won a Nobel Prize in medicine for her research on corn chromosomes and cytogenetics, maize cytogenetics. And Barbara McClintock talked about the screaming of the grass, right? It kind of described that everything is one. And this concept is something that I draw from, and from other philosophers, this idea of univocity, that in fact, everything kind of exists in this one immanent plane. That's not to say things aren't different, they are, but that we no longer have that kind of great chain of being. And you're right to point out that this is a very kind of Jain way of seeing the world. It's a very different way to invite those that are around us into our sense of world making. And so, you know, and I'm sorry, I have a 1 o'clock appointment. I'm going to have to probably run soon after this, but, you know, when I was young, about 6 or 7 years old, my grandmother came to live with us, and she was from India. And I was sitting out in the backyard one day, and I was just pulling out the grass. And my grandmother said to me, "Deboleena, why are you doing that? You know, the grass has a right to live as well. Why would you kill it?" And so I thought about that, and it was the first time I thought, oh, so things around me can also be living. And I think it had a great impact on me.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I wonder if I could take the last question, or was there two? And then I'll take all the questions, and then maybe I can stick around a few more minutes, Gray.
So Spencer is the last one up, I think.
Okay.
Deboleena, hi. It's good to see you. I'm Mike and Joan's cousin.
Yes, I recognize you. It's nice to see you.
Well, this is great. I was digging through some old boxes of things, and I found this a collection of lectures by Jim Laney. Jim Laney used to be president of Emory, and they were written in the late '80s, right before he left and became ambassador to South Korea. And he was bemoaning the fact that universities, he didn't call Emory out by name, but that's where he worked, were we're getting so technical. We're getting so training people for careers, not for life in general, and that we, you know, the financial push toward entrepreneurship and so forth, we're shortchanging the development of people that he thought was important. So I guess the question is, 20-something years later, are we at Emory bringing the humanities into our pre-everything students? We used to joke that everybody at Emory was pre-something. So
I can hear it for a minute.
I'm very sorry. One second.
Deboleena's on. I think Deboleena, we cannot see you.
I'm very sorry. There we go.
Oh, I don't know if you heard the question or not.
I did. Sorry. I heard the first part. I would.
It was just this thing that Jim Laney wrote about worrying that universities were not we're getting too career oriented, and we're moving people toward what would be economically advantageous to them, but not developing the people fully in the way. So I'm just wondering at Emory, what do you think we're doing? You're multiculturalist, to bring our pre-something students, everybody's pre-something, the pre-med or the pre-law or something like pre-business. How do we, are we doing that with the undergraduates? Or are we bringing them along properly?
Yeah, so, you know, I've been at Emory for 11 years now. And I think, you know, I've always heard people talk about the importance of the liberal arts education and the role of Emory College, for example, and all of those kind of, and, you know, the pre-business, the pre-law, and the pre-medical students that we have. And how important the work is of our college faculty to kind of create well-rounded students. And I will say, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the talk, is I have a new view of Emory ever since I became an Emory parent. I have seen, so you've met my daughter, actually. You know, Kale is now in second year. And it immediately became a concern to me in a new way that I had not thought of before, that my daughter needs to be well-rounded and ready for the world. No, if she becomes pre-business or pre-law, and is Emory going to be able to measure up and do what it needs to do to help prepare my own child? And I will tell you that from the moment that she was being, you know, recruited to Emory, and this idea of what Emory can deliver, and that one has to become like a partner, actually, with not just, you know, your fellow students, but with the Atlanta community, with kind of a global community. That emphasis and that messaging was spot on from day one for her. And so I don't know when, you know, the previous president was here and how things were, but I'm certain he must have put a lot he must have laid down the groundwork, because 2 years ago when my daughter started, that is the messaging that she's getting. And I'm hoping that her friends are also receiving the same, that, this is pre-pandemic, that we have to care about the world around us and the other people. And I think
Jim was a theologian and a philosopher, but he also got Mr. Woodruff to give the biggest gift ever to Emory. So
yeah, so he knew what he was doing. He definitely knew what he was doing. And I would like to say that something was put in place so that I have witnessed this, that a generation of students who are coming through here are realizing that this is not just about getting good grades and getting out the door and making money, that Emory is actually providing a different space for growth. That's my hope.
I'm glad she's having that experience. Yeah.